Presenting for Explicit, Bettina Knudsen.
Thank you. Hello. Wow, that's quite an introduction. I think you just named our drone. Thank you very much for having us. It's a great privilege and honor to be here. My name is Bettina Knudsen, and I'm here to represent Explicit. We're a small IT company based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And what I'm here to talk about is Project Sense, which is an environmental monitoring solution focused at monitoring ship emissions during cruise. I need to take this thing. Now, doesn't work. Something should be switching, but it doesn't. Thank you. Now, the object of Project Sense is basically to catch sulfur emission violators at sea. And the way we do it is we use self-guided, low-cost drones that are fitted with sniffer technology to fly out, seek out, detect, and document ships that don't comply with the emission regulations. Now, when preparing for this, I was trying to come up with a good analogy of what is this really about, right? Now, the best thing I could come up with is the breathalyzer. You all know the breathalyzer, right? Now, imagine what it was like for police officers to catch drunken drivers before they had the breathalyzer. It's actually a pretty complex task, very difficult to do. Much like the breathalyzer, what our solution does is it's basically a first line of defense against sulfur violators. What we're about is we're trying to qualify the enforcement task and trying to see, okay, who do we need to home in on here? Who are the ones that, we have indications that we should be watching out for? Who are the ones that we should take out for fuel sampling when they get into port? That's what this is all about. So, if you don't remember anything else, have that picture in your mind. This is a little bit like the breathalyzer, but for ships, okay? Now, the problem, I don't need to tell you guys that ships pollute, and it's a huge problem. Now, what I want to focus on is actually that there are solutions out there. And one of the great things about this is actually that the world is reacting. Through the MARPOL Convention, Annex 6 as it's called, the UN and the world nations are coming together and setting emission restrictions on shipping. And they're actually being quite ambitious. When you look at it from the outside, I think it's quite an impressive legal framework. It's global. It sets limits, global limits on sulfur emissions, nitrous dioxide emissions, particle emissions for ships. And it also defines emission control areas where stricter controls on emissions apply. This is actually a great framework. Now, the emission control areas I was talking about, we have two of them in the world today. One is the North American ECA, 200 nautical miles off of the coast of North America. The other one is the North European ECA. Now, in these two areas, ships, when they enter into these areas, have to switch from 3.5% sulfur content fuel down to 1% sulfur content fuel. And MARPOL sets these limits, as I said, very, very ambitiously. What's going to happen, right now we're at 3.5 on the global limit, we're at 1% on the ECA limits. But in a very short few months, the ECA limit is going to drop down to 0.1%. And when we hit 2020, the global limit is going to drop all the way down to 0.5%. Now, if you think about the implication of this, if everyone complied to this, it will be a massive positive effect on the air quality, right? Because we'll really start reducing air pollution from shipping drastically. Now, there's only one problem. The industry doesn't really have an incentive to comply. In fact, when we hit the 1st of January, they're likely going to have the opposite. They're going to have a huge competitive incentive not to comply because it's going to cost them a bundle to lower their sulfur levels from 1% to 0.1% when they sail in the ECAs. Now, smarter people than I have tried to estimate what we're talking about in numbers. We're actually talking about a boost to the industry fuel bill every year of $50 billion. That's huge. So, What do the ships think? Well, what's the risk here? Well, there really isn't any, because we're not really doing much enforcement-wise. So, what do I want to do? Do I want to keep, sailing on bunker oil that's, has higher sulfur content in it because there's really no, risk of getting caught, or do I want to comply? The risk if we don't find enforcement technologies to, really lift the promise of MARPOL is that, MARPOL is just going to be all good intentions, no effect, and a crippled industry. Because it's going to hit the green leaders, right? Because they won't be able to compete anymore, and it's going to benefit all the ones who don't play by the rules. That's what we're trying to change. Now, the problem we have here, can you switch, please? Thank you. Challenge of enforcement. The problem is, it's really difficult to do. When you think about it, ships are all the way out there to sea. How are you going to get to them? Right? When they pollute. Real difficult. Now, the technologies that are in use today, the enforcement technologies, basically what you see here on the one hand side, the fuel delivery notes and the fuel sampling. That's what's being done today. Fuel delivery notes is a self-reporting system, and the problem with that is, well, it's self-reporting, right? And the credibility on it is not that high. We know they are being tampered with. Now, fuel samples, that's a very good method. It's a lab-based method. It's very accurate. There's only one problem. It happens post-violation. It happens in port. It doesn't capture transit traffic. It's also somewhat manpower intensive, and it causes delays, even to the ships that do comply. Not the best technology. Now, what's being tested right now are also land-based fixed installations and sniffer airplanes. Basically, they work off of two different sensoring technologies. One is they do remote sensing, which is optical-based sensing, and the other thing is they do sniffing, just like we do, which is basically you take a sample of the plume, right? And from that, you determine the sulfur content. Now, land-based fixed installations, well, they're fixed, right? And by nature, both for them and for the sniffer airplanes, the problem is they are extremely costly to deploy. And they're costly to deploy because in the case of the fixed installations, the measuring devices on these things are very, very expensive. And they are so because they're far from the source. The further you get from an emission source, the more costly your sensors will be because they have to be more accurate, more sensitive. It's all about the 11th decimal, right? Now, the sniffer airplane, well, an airplane is awfully expensive, and it is expensive to equip and deploy and get it in the air, and it's very difficult to scale, right? You got one going, now you need another one. That's not so easy, and you're going to have to first equip it and get it certified, and and it takes time to get these things in the air. And again, they cost a lot of money. Now, Project Sense basically utilizes low-cost drones. We're buying these off the shelf. We don't develop the airframes. There are plenty of airframes, plenty of good systems out there that we can use. We pick those off the shelf. We also pick the sensors off the shelf, and we put the whole thing together in a solution where basically you have a self-guided drone that flies out, sniffs the flumes, and reports back in real time. Now, the problem, obviously, with any drone technology, is always battery endurance and its range, right? And by range, I mean how far are you allowed to fly away from your launch point. We'll go back to that. Now, a little on the specs. The drone we're flying with right now, the airframe we're using, is an airframe from 3D Robotics. It's an Aero. I don't know if anybody of you know it. It's a really good airframe. It performs really well, and it allows us one thing which is very important, which is slow flight. We want to be able to slow down as we go through the plume so we get as many measurements, as good sampling as we possibly can. Now, why is Project Sense different from the other technologies? Well, basically, we sat down. There are three approaches in this that are uniquely different. First of all, we said, well, accuracy and sensitivity, that's all really, that's fine, but it's really unnecessary. If we can get close enough to the source, and we'll be fine. We only need to determine whether we're above or below 1%, right? The 11th decimal doesn't add any value to the equation. That's the first sort of approach to this that's unique. The second approach is we're using a sampling methodology, which is basically a ratio between CO2 and SO2, right? And this ratio is constant throughout the plume. So it doesn't really, distance, we're not really dependent on distance to the ship. Obviously, we have to be within the plume, but it's not like we have to be on an exact distance to the funnel. Now, these two things put together lead to the third conclusion. You know what? We can do this with low-cost components that are already there. If we put them together smart enough, they can do the job. And what makes this possible is that we've seen a revolution in the sensoring technologies, bringing down the price of performance sensors, small performance sensors, electrochemical sensors like we're using. And we've seen, obviously, huge development on the drone side, which means we can get cheap, sturdy airframes, right? We can get open source autopiloting systems. These are getting pretty standardized. So all the components are there to put it together. I had somebody ask me not too long ago, what are you really? Are you innovators or are you integrators? And my response was, we're very innovative integrators, right? Now, the whole point of this is we're ending up with a cost-efficient, very reliable, very scalable method for enforcement, because we can, do many drones and send up many drones. Thank you. There are two secret ingredients to the sauce. One is the concept of smart flight. Our drone is guided basically by 4 principles: the position and the movement of the ship, position and movement of the drone, the wind, speed, and direction, and finally also the plume itself, spread model, and the gas concentrations. So we're also correcting as we measure, right? So we're making sure we stay in the plume. Everything is caught up into a online storage, reported back to the authorities. Principles of sampling, as I said, it's a ratio. We're tracking the center line of the plume. We're doing continuous sampling throughout the plume. And we also, and this is the second secret ingredient to the sauce, the way we're actually doing the sampling, the sensor pack we got inside the drone is set up so it can create steady state over the sensors. Now, you need that in order to be able to get good readings, right? So, those are the principles, basically. Can you turn it again? This thing only works twice. Back to the sensors. But Bettina, you're using low-cost sensors. Can they really perform? Now, what I'm showing you here is lab results, but they're very, very good at illustrating what we're dealing with here. This is a scenario in which we are injecting a ratio, that's the green bars, and you can see with the blue bars what the sensors are actually measuring. But that's not on spot, Bettina. It's not good enough. This is a log 10 scale, right? Basically, I have 10 on 10 difference. I can tell the difference between these 3 levels: 3.5, 1%, and 0.1%. This is also an absolute worst case scenario where we're stress testing the sensor, the sulfur sensor, because we're adding extra nitrogen dioxide. Now, sulfur dioxide sensors have cross-reference with NO2. So, and that's a problem you need to correct for. So if you're in a scenario where you have an awfully lot of NO2, which is not that common, you need to have a very special engine in order to see that scenario. Yeah, sure, you're getting into a little bit of a stress scenario, but that's not what we normally see.
Time for questions?
Yep. I only have a couple of more slides, and then we can move on to slides. Now, the final thing I want to touch upon here as well is in terms of software. We have 4 modules working together. We have a smart flight system, we have a sampling system, we have a diagnostic systems, and we have, obviously, the administrative and reporting system. And they all work together to make this happen. Now, this is where I need you guys' input, because this is all software. Now it's a drone, and it's sulfur violators that we're targeting, but it could easily be something else. It doesn't need to be smart flight. It could be smart movement of a rover. It doesn't need to be sulfur we're measuring. It could be something else. So there are many applications that we can use this for as well on the same data acquisition platform that we've developed. Okay? Now, I want to just, if I can, as a final thing, right? Where can drones really make a real difference? Well, I come from Denmark, small country, but we have an awful lot of ship traffic, and we do so because we sit right at the entry point to the Baltic Sea, right? 24,000 transits are what we see every year. We've, modeled a case down here. If we had a one pilot team, right, that went and did 500 inspections annually, that's about 50 to 60 flight days for us, right? Let's assume 10, maybe a little bit below that, inspections per day. One pilot team, 2 pilots, all 3 routes, we would cover 1 in 50 ships. Now, I don't remember if you saw one of the other slides, it said 1 in 50. Sorry, 1 in 500. Now we're covering 1 in 50. This makes a huge difference. Our idea is not to sell the drone. Our idea is to sell a full-service contract to the enforcement authorities. Let us handle this enforcement staff for you. We'll report back to you. What you do with the knowledge, that's up to you. Right? You can also lease the fleet if you want to do it like that. A sniffer airplane costs up to $1.2 million. I can equip and deploy a drone for $4,000, less than $4,000 in 48 hours. Now, it's a completely different economics in this. So the cost model is completely different from the other technologies that we're seeing. Can I do more, or do you?
Let's go to questions. Just make sure that you got enough, and if we need to jump
I've got
ahead.
more slides, but maybe some of the slides answers your questions. So
it may do.
Let's just stop here and start with the questions.
We've got 3 microphones here, and those of you on the beams, if you want to just come up, you're certainly welcome to. And while you're lining up to ask questions, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
But how close to the stack do you have to be with the drone?
We need to be within, and sorry, I'm European, so for me it's in meters. We need to be within 50 to 100 meters of the stack.
So you really have to fly up to the plane?
Yeah.
Okay. And how far offshore can you fly?
Well, now we're moving into the next, and I'm going to switch the slides a little bit because this will answer.
See how she did that? That was brilliant. That was just
brilliant. Now you get tips for all the rest of you who come later. Can you switch, because this really doesn't work? A little bit further. We'll go back to this one at some point. A little bit further. Thank you. A little bit further. This is all what I've been talking about. A little bit further. Thank you. There we go. License to operate. Key issue for anyone working with drone technology today. Complying with aviation code. Now, the problem we have is basically the regulations don't consider autonomous flight, which is what we're doing.
Right.
Right? So it limits our range because basically, and this is drone speak on the one side, you see the second one is VLOS, visual line of sight. That's the normal restriction you have when you fly drones. We need to physically, with the naked eye, be able to see the drone, right? Now, you can do extended line of sight, and you can do beyond line of sight. What we're doing right now is we're in dialogue with our transport authority, that would be the equivalent to your FAA, about setting inspection zones that we'll be allowed to fly beyond line of sight to do our inspections. Now, from the map I showed you of Denmark, I have plenty of sites as well where I can do visual line of sight. But I also have a couple of sites where it would be nice to do beyond line of sight. So this is a dialogue that we're having with the authorities, and anyone who's working with drones knows this is a challenge we all have to tackle at some point.
Okay, next question is, and please, I don't want to be the only one asking questions. So if you've got a question, please step up to a mic and I'll recognize you. When you say autonomous flight, define that. Do you mean nobody's flying? Is completely?
It means it's very boring to be a pilot of one of our drones, because once you launch it, it's off doing its thing on its own, and you're standing there with your coffee waiting for it to come home.
Okay, all right. And so the flight plan is completely computerized?
The flight plan is completely computerized. I've actually got a simulation model. More than welcome to come and see it. I'm the one with the Lego ship, and I'll show you exactly how the software works, right? The principle behind it.
We have a question?
So I'm very interested in sulfur emissions, thanks to various friends who are in the room. And my question to you is this. You start out with an analogy to breathalyzer tests and alcohol, where the tests are really quite accurate and they do their work. There's not a lot of incentive in the alcohol industry, such as it is the liquor industry, to try and defeat that test. Suppose the analogy instead were to antiperspirants, okay? So with the costs of the change in fuel being as high as they are and the incentive to disguise what ships are doing being what it might be, is it possible for the shipping industry to invent disguises against the sulfur emissions, and do you have a way of coming at that?
This is a little like the question of when you do, speed tests, and they had a whole wave of, CD-ROMs that you had to have hanging or whatever, not to get caught in the speed traps, right?
Yeah.
Basically, first of all, the position and identity of the ships is not something we invent, right? We're working off of IAS data. Now, the IAS data, if they start meddling with that, we're dealing with a whole different issue because, suddenly you're talking collision risks and, we're not the only ones who are very interested in reliable IAS data. So if they start tampering with that, right, we're just picking up what everybody else is picking up. They're transmitting this, right? That's not a really likely scenario because there are so many other implications if they start messing with that. Now, some other things what they might do, they might GPS jamming. But our autopilot system and our software on board actually, reverses that. So we've got mechanisms against that. They can't just jam us. Somebody said, what if they shoot you out of the sky? Yeah, I don't remember. I think that was the reception yesterday. What if they shoot you out of the sky, And some captain with an extremely, good eyesight and a very lucky day might do that. And the only thing I can do is I can quote the transport authority who said, then we have a completely different scenario. Because essentially the way they look at it would be exactly as if you were, firing at an aircraft, basically, right? That's a serious safety risk. And I will tell you that ship, once it gets into port, it won't just be fuel sampled. So, does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay.
Right. We have another question over here.
Very good presentation, thank you. I have a question regarding certification and regulatory on your sampling methodology.
Mm-hmm. On the sampling or the flight?
Not the flight, the sampling.
The sampling.
How do you certify your method and approach?
Well, we're doing two things. First of all, the sensors that we buy come with certifications and testing. They're done so from the manufacturer. That's not just important to us, it's important to anyone who buys sensors, right? They need to know exactly how those sensors perform. So we get actually a spec list on those specific sensors that have gone through the labs. We take those specs and we implement them into our software. So we mirror exactly what they say, they've measured and exactly how these sensors work. So in a certain way, we're relying on what the manufacturer is saying, but what we're also doing is we're doing our own lab testing. And we're doing that together with Force Technology, which is one of our leading maritime technology institutes who we're working very closely with this. That's another thing I want to say. We're very privileged to have an awful lot of attention, particularly from the Danish government these days. We have two government grants in place. We're working very closely with the EPA. We're working with the Maritime Authority, Transport Authority I already mentioned. The Naval Admiralty will be getting involved as well. There's a lot of focus on our little project here, which is very, very good. And that's another thing, of the mitigating factors here in terms of flight. It's an authoritative task that we are trying to solve. That's a nice ace up your sleeve in terms of this whole dialogue of beyond line of sight.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Go for that. If we can keep it short, we've got about a minute.
Very fast. I've enjoyed it. Thank you. We got two business people sitting in the audience, know nothing about technology, but we know a thing or two about business. And so, who is charged with the enforcement? Is it MARPOL? It's also, because the basic underlying question is, where's the market? Who's the market for it? Who is purchasing this technology?
The clients for this are the enforcement authorities. Now that would, in the case of the US, for instance, now the enforcement task lies in the hands of the EPA, but they're outsourcing the actual enforcement to the Coast Guard. I believe we do actually have somebody from the Coast Guard here. In the case of Denmark, same thing. It's our EPA that has, the legal responsibility, but the outsourcing, the actual operations, you might say, to the Maritime Authority. Now, our business model is very simple. To offer these authorities, basically, say, a full-service model and to say, you know, we'll solve it for you. We'll do all these missions, right? You buy a certain number of inspection days per year, and we'll make it happen for you. We'll decide together with you what inspection points we'll use, right? Where we'll fly from, basically. And you're charged, you know, by the hour, by the inspection day, just like you would see any other model. If this were a leasing model, well, basically we would lease you the drone. If you, for whatever reason, have, you know, in-house piloting capabilities. Our authority doesn't. They're not particularly interested in flying this. You know, they're interested in somebody bringing them a full package deal, and that's what we're doing.
All right. Thank you. Bettina, that was great. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Skies are clear? Glad to hear it, Sergey.
At an altitude of over 30,000 feet, Sergey, the salty sea dog, soars through the atmosphere, sniffing out fumes that could kill us all.
Right.
Follow his nose as he fights the evil pollutants CO2, NO2, SO2, and more.
Thank you, Sergey. You saved us all again. Good boy.
By day, by night, always at sea, only returning to sleep and refuel, Sergey, like any true American, never leaves his post.
Tell you what, when we get back, I'm gonna get you a nice big bone to bury.
I didn't know you were a vegan.
Friendship.
Sergey, you've been out there too long.
Ingrid and the puppies still need you. You have 6 long years to live, man.
Just come home.
Suspense.
What did you just say about my wife?
Sergey?
Tension. Action, loyalty, olfactory. The maritime theatrical event of the summer. Man's best friend, Sergey the Salty Sea Dog in High-Flying Adventures with Sergey the Salty Sea Dog. Come see it in 3D.